Hi, and welcome to a very special episode of History Respawn. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we'll be diving back into Assassin's Creed Discovery Tour Viking Age, but we will be joined by one of the game's historical advisors, Dr. Alison Hudson. Dr. Hudson is an adjunct professor of history at the University of Central Florida, and her research focuses on early medieval history and the study of medieval manuscripts. Alison's doctoral research at the University of Oxford focused on English monastic reform and saints' cults in the 10th century. Between 2015 and 2018, she was a project curator at the British Library and worked on the Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms exhibition. Alison, welcome to History Respawn.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Sure, we're very happy to have you. And we were going to play through in this episode this second quest through Faith and Fire, which has got your name on it. How does that feel to have your name attached to a part of Assassin's Creed and a part of this Discovery Tour mode?
Oh, the creators were very, very kind to do that. But I just contributed a little bit about the historical documents. It's really, I think, a credit to Assassin's Creed and the world they've created and the commitment all the way along to try to really recreate some of these historical worlds that the game looks and feels the way it does. So all credit to the designers. I'm just lucky to have been a small part of it.
That leads me into my first question, and I'll go ahead and reset this quest so that we can start from the beginning and you can kind of give us some insights as we go along. But my first question is, how did you come to work on this project to begin with?
So the creators of the game contacted me and they asked if this is the sort of thing I'd be interested in doing. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to present historical research in a different way and to give people an opportunity to interact with documents and sort of imagine what the world was like and to present that to a general audience. So I was really excited when they contacted me.
And did you have any experience with games or game development prior to this point?
No experience with game development or really any kind of historical consulting. I never consulted on films or books or anything like that. However, as you mentioned, I had worked in public history and public-facing historical presentations before, particularly at the British Library, where I worked on that exhibition and also on their blog and Twitter accounts too. So that gave me some experience of maybe thinking about how to make history more engaging. But yeah, nothing like this before.
Wow, that's great. And so did the developers, did they come to you with this storyline already in place, or did you have any influence over this story involving this monastery and Brother Elric, or was it something they already had written and you just kind of advised on?
So they already had chosen Ely. They already had the outlines of the story, and they did a great job. It's a really, I really think it was a really clever monastery to pick because it's not Lindisfarne, which is the famous one that everybody hears about, being attacked by Vikings. It's that island on the coast that is one of the first recorded Viking attacks. There are records of plenty of sort of Scandinavian attacks and activity in this area of Cambridgeshire, however, and Ely is another really major abbey. And it's also a double house, which means it has both men and women. It's representative of this sort of a very early medieval monastic setup. Therefore, I thought it was a really clever choice for the game designers to already have alighted on this very distinctive kind of house with this very, very rich history. Mm-hmm. And so from there, I just helped them fill in some of the questions they might have, particularly about medieval medicine. As you'll see, that's part of the quest going forward, and the relics and what Ely might have been like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that this is a clever decision by the developers. And, I don't know if you'd had any experience with any of the previous versions of Discovery Tour. They had done one for Assassin's Creed Origins, which is set in ancient Egypt, and then they also had one for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which was set in ancient Greece during the Peloponnesian War. And so in both those versions, the storyline tended to, well, there wasn't a storyline. It was just kind of a collection of basically museum exhibitions, and you were giving the player the option to go through and click on them, but not necessarily giving them a narrative thrust to drive their interest. And I think they've made a major overhaul to Discovery Tour here, where we've got player characters, we've got roles that they have in life, and then also activities that they can participate in, including morning prayer, as we see here.
Yeah, I think that overhaul was due. The credit should go to Antoine and Maxime and all the people who developed the game. I think they've really thought through how to make this most engaging and most educational.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, from your perspective, having worked in public history, having worked at the British Library, I'm wondering, what do you make of Discovery Tour, as kind of a comparison to other public history projects?
Yeah, so Discovery Tour is really exciting because there's currently a movement in some parts of historical pedagogy and teaching towards gamification.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of scholars who are working on teaching are thinking about the ways in which, when something's presented as a game, when it's a quest or a puzzle, how humans absorb that information a little bit differently and how they interact and emotionally react to it a little bit differently as well. Therefore, I think this Discovery Tour project and all the different iterations come at just the right time when people are really thinking through the potential for presenting historical information in new and engaging ways.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, for this period in particular, because a lot of these places don't exist above ground anymore, so Ely, the early medieval abbey doesn't exist anymore. It's got that sort of gorgeous post-conquest cathedral now on top of the site. The churches at Winchester, again, were sort of are now underground, and they're sort of post-conquest edifices on top of them. I think for this period as well, presenting it through a video game is a really rich opportunity to bring to life and to try to literally reconstruct and reimagine a world that otherwise is being presented to students as just archaeological floor plans of what might have existed once, which sometimes can be a little bit difficult for students to fully get into and fully imagine how cool it might have been.
Yeah, it does. I've talked to some other museum and public history professionals about Discovery Tour, and a lot of them, working in the States, they kind of point to this as a meeting spot between museum public history and then historical reenactment, and putting the player in that role of being able to come into contact with kind of museum-like excerpts that you can see here, but then also being able to be in the world of that era. And of course, the developers are taking a lot of license with the way that they're depicting the era, but at the same time, I think it's much more interesting than perhaps what you would have, like you said, at an archaeological dig site, which I went to many of those when I was in high school and also undergrad, and I found the documents much more interesting than just going out to a field in the middle of nowhere and digging in the dirt. Maybe if I'd had something like this, I would have been more interested in archaeology. Who knows?
Absolutely. I think you need a lot of imagination to be a good archaeologist. And
yeah.
But again, one of the things I think that makes this game stand out is they do have these primary sources embedded throughout the game.
Mm-hmm.
So here's an image from a 10th century, sort of probably made around between the 960s and the 980s. This manuscript, and it's one of the earliest images we have of Athelfrith, who's this saint who founded Ely and who's central to Ely's history. And one of the things that made me really, really excited about this Discovery Tour is it's not just about creating a good story with a little sprinkling of historical bits over the top. They really do explain where this information comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's quite important for students to be able to understand that history isn't all written down in a book. The answers aren't all in the back. It's not the sort of neat packaged narrative they're often presented with. It's detective work, and these are the sorts of clues that we use as historians.
And I love, too, that there's the manuscript reference here. I just, as a historian, this is something I never would have expected to have seen in a video game, let alone, even a historical video game, one that's kind of focused like this one is on educating. So that's pretty remarkable. And then, I think, too, having played previous versions of Discovery Tour, it's also really great to have the historical advisors on this project, including yourself, cited by the game, which is something that didn't happen in previous versions. So I think narratively this game is much more interesting, but then also as a professional scholar, it's much easier to recommend because it has all of these nice touches that, you would expect to see in a public history project put together by a scholar, or, in a museum exhibition, for instance.
And all credit for that goes to the creators. They were really committed to making this as useful and as educational as possible. And I think that really shows through.
So I'm just going to go on to the next quest marker here. And I guess as I play through this, could you give us a little bit of insight into what your experience was like working with the developers? Was it the type of thing where they came to you with specific questions and you kind of recommended certain directions or certain documents to include? And how was all that put together?
It was a really wonderful experience working with the creators of this game because, as we were just discussing, they really were committed to making this historically accurate. They really had the same goals in mind. They really had education and students in mind, and therefore it made it really easy to collaborate with them when you had these sorts of similar goals you're both working towards. So the way it usually would work is that they would ask me specific questions. So what we see here is a monk who's becoming ill, and the quest is centered around this idea that you are one of his fellow monks, and you have to go and you have to find the ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
And that I helped them with. There's a medieval manuscript called Bald's Leech Book that we might see a bit later on that includes a list of medical remedies. So what we did is I sort of, they said we probably need to have different locations to find ingredients. So if there's a remedy with something that might be found in a kitchen, a remedy with something that might be found out in the fields, maybe somewhere else around the abbey. And so I created a little document with remedies that sort of fit the bill, that had ingredients coming from that you'd have to go to different sites to find, and then we sort of whittled it down. And so the remedy they chose is one that is a remedy for pain, which is sort of informs the start of this quest. The symptoms he's having reflect the symptoms that are mentioned in the manuscript, and then you then have to go to the library to try to look up remedies, and you meet Sister Winfred, and all of that is sort of chosen based on a real medieval remedy book, and that's what I helped with. I sort of provided those sorts of questions. Additionally, I helped with the sources, so some of the manuscript images you see I recommended. And I also read over the final scripts and things just to make sure that everything was as it should be, and there weren't any sort of howlers or something that was completely anachronistic.
That sounds so great. And, it's wonderful that you were able to pull that from an actual historical manuscript. And I'll just I'll keep going here for a moment just so the audience can see the actual course of this quest. And I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the things, with previous versions of Discovery Tour for Ancient Egypt, Ancient Greece, is that a lot of the kind of tours were focused on, things that I think the most players would be interested in. So there was a lot of stuff about kind of the military. There was stuff about architecture, but there wasn't much related to kind of everyday life issues. And so I think that's one of the great things about this quest line is you're getting a look at a wholly different realm of life during this era, not necessarily related to weapons or assassinations or military exercises, but instead related to life on in a monastery, and then also related to health and illness and general welfare, which I think is, at least as a scholar, I think is really exciting because you're getting kind of a wider view of life at this time period.
Absolutely. I hope it's good. And yeah, it is exciting that they include all these different areas because monasteries really were hugely important in this era. It's kind of like if you had the local hospital, plus the local school / university, plus the local library, plus the mall, because there were often sort of fairs held nearby the monasteries, plus a religious center all rolled into one. So I'm glad that the designers really took time to reflect some of the key locations for everyday life in this world, and not didn't just have sort of this one focus on the warrior aristocrats of the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, I am a fan of this game series, and so it is fun to be able to play as somebody who is closely related to major historical events and fighting and warfare and battles. But I also think that, it's kind of a waste because the developers, they spend so much time creating these little instances with non-player characters, like we see Elric playing out here. And it seems like there is this huge opportunity to make use of those assets for other things, for educational opportunities. So I think the whole project is fantastic.
Yeah. And I think what's exciting about this as well is I know the developers made a real effort to try to minimize the violence. I mean, obviously, it's the Viking Age. The monastery's about to be attacked by Vikings. Sorry, spoiler alert.
Spoilers.
So there is sort of allusions to war and stuff like that. But it was really interesting to me that they were taking a lot of these properties and putting them and really making an effort to make it sort of non-violent, or at least sort of more available to a more general audience. And I thought that was really exciting because there have been some really interesting studies done recently on how few video games can fall into sort of the non-violent or the less violent category. And so I think that again is sort of pushing the boundaries in terms of video gaming and sort of the themes found in video games that is exciting as well, that what these designers are up to. I'm also very excited about the inclusion of Sister Winifred, because Bob's Leech book, the manuscript that has all these medical remedies, as usual with medieval manuscripts, annoyingly describes that sign their names. We don't know exactly who made it, but there is an argument made by Matthew Parks, the very, very famous paleographer who studied old handwritings. He argues that the manuscript could have been made by nuns in Winchester, not necessarily by men, which is quite exciting. And indeed, when Elrich goes to Winchester, he sort of pops up in the Nunneminster in their infirmary. So I thought that it's these kinds of tiny details that
that's fun.
Developers managed to sort of weave in, that I think make this so rich. And it really is all credit to them for being so inventive and for being so willing to take on all these little details on board and really weave them in.
Yeah, absolutely. I had no idea. That's such a great little insight there. And so is that manuscript, is that included in the collection of documents here in the learning section? Do you know?
It should be somewhere.
Yeah, let's take a look. Let me scroll down here. Obviously not in myths and legends. Science, maybe?
Possibly under science. Let's see.
Medicines, medics, maybe.
Oh, there it is. That's it.
Okay. So we've got this.
And they've highlighted the words that are the basis for the quest.
Got it. Remedy, so dry pain, right?
Yes. Yes. It's annoyingly the quest with the best sort of ingredients for going out and sort of finding them, or the remedy that was best suited to a quest where you have to go to different locations. And there's a debate about exactly what Theor, this first word, is. But yeah, so I think dry pain is what we went with after a very common translation. But you can sort of see in the middle, sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 lines up from the bottom, you can see Hunig. So mid-Hunig drink. So you make a honey drink.
Fantastic. And so just a question about this document. I mean, what kind of state is this? I would imagine this is, a photograph taken of it, but what kind of state is this document in the British Library? Is it something that anybody off the street, any researcher could go and take a look at, or is it something that's kept behind, lock and key? What kind of opportunity do people have to see these types of documents?
So if you can get a card for the British Library's manuscripts reading room, you could call it up, and indeed you've got the reference number right there, Royal MS 12D17 in Roman numerals. So if you wanted to, you could go and see that. But I know with the ongoing pandemic and so on, there aren't many opportunities to travel. So luckily, this manuscript is available fully digitized on the British Library's website. So if you go to bl.uk/manuscripts, and you just copy and paste in that reference number, Royal MS 12D17, you can find it. You can look at it at home, wherever you are, of whatever time you like. You can zoom in really close. The manuscript is now accessible to really anybody with internet access.
Wow. That's
Thanks for
fantastic.
communication.
That's one of the things. I'm a modern historian, and all of our documents are actually in archives. Not many of them are actually digitized, and so I'm always jealous when I hear early modernists, medievalists, ancient scholars, classicists talk about, oh yeah, they didn't want anybody touching these documents anymore, so they digitized them, and I'm just like, oh, if only I could have that.
Yeah. There is with digitization, of course, you need to get people to fund it. So it's a bit.
Yeah.
I always feel sorry for people who have a lot of archive work because there's just so much there, and trying to figure out what can be funded, for what can get funding, and of course it takes a lot of work as well.
Yeah.
It's not just photographing; it's the metadata too. So
Yes.
fingers crossed, the modernists will get your chance soon.
One day we will have our opportunity. Of course, then the other modernist problem is there's just so many documents. Whereas I know for early medieval history in particular, there's often not many documents, and so the ones that are there, it's really important to preserve them as long as possible.
Absolutely. And you may notice some points of the game when we're saying, oh, we don't know exactly what this was like, or, there are documents from just a little bit later and we're kind of inferring backwards. And that's because lots of the questions that the game brings up, we don't necessarily know exactly what the layout of Ely was, because there's now a giant cathedral on top of it. And obviously, the people don't want us digging under the nice cathedral. So there's still lots of questions like that still exist. This again is where the game can be really, really rich in helping us interact with some of these questions, and at least creating a framework for thinking about some of the possibilities.
Exactly, and kind of understanding the lived space of the past, which I think, even as a modernist, can often be very difficult to get across to students and to, people during public exhibitions. Is some of these things weren't possible just because of the state of the world at that time and how they were living and, what kind of environment they were in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm wondering, I'm curious a bit with your experience with, the Anglo-Saxon era and presenting that in public. Do you find, in Britain itself, do you find that there's a great deal of remaining interest in this era of history, or do you think that it's one of those eras of history that is kind of overwhelmed by, say, the modern era or other parts of the medieval world?
That's an excellent question. And it is the pre-conquest bit of history is always a bit of a tricky sell, because there is still this belief that history begins in 1066. You see lots of books which have that sort of, the Norman conquest is the kickoff date for the rest of English history, and what comes before is not important. But this period is actually really crucial. It's when the English language is first developed. Mm-hmm. It's when the Kingdom of England, basically with very much its modern borders, emerges out of all the cobbled together out of all these much smaller kingdoms. In the game, you're actually in the Kingdom of East Anglia, which is its own separate thing at this point until it's overrun by Scandinavians, and then the West Saxons will conquer it later on in the 10th century. So a lot of really exciting things are happening in this period, and I'm glad that the game developers are helping to bring this particular era of history to a wider audience. Mm-hmm. I think it's also important at this particular stage that they're sort of bringing the real history to a modern audience, because unfortunately there are lots of very unsavory groups who have all kinds of supremacist agendas that unfortunately like to grab on to different parts of the early medieval world, which is very unfortunate. Mm-hmm. And there's now there are sort of debates about how historians can best confront and make it clear that you can't use early medieval evidence to justify very nasty modern nationalist programs. Yeah. But I think the game designers have done a great job with that, sort of acknowledging the diversity in this world. In some of these quests, they talk about the fact that people communicated with the outside world. Some of the medical remedies come from the Mediterranean, and there are long-distance contacts through trade all the way to India and Sri Lanka. So I think it's really wonderful that the game designers are bringing the real history to a much wider audience, mm-hmm. and really dispelling a lot of those stereotypes, either that it's the Dark Ages and nothing happened and we don't know, or anything like that.
Right. I think that's such a great point. Really, really well said there. And I'd imagine now that you're in the States that you probably see your fair share of questionable interests in the medieval past along the lines that you just outlined. I feel like when it comes to History Respawn audience, most of our European audience, they are aware, for the most part, of the real history and, of the kind of ins and outs of this era. But it's the American audience that is often, filled up, sometimes through no fault of their own, filled up with these kind of misnomers, misconceptions about this period that have been bred for political reasons in many cases.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's really great that the real history is getting out there and that people aren't just sort of consigning the early Middle Ages to, well, they were the Dark Ages, or, nobody's too worried about them, and then letting it all sort of become, letting stereotypes and sort of false narratives prevail. So yeah, I think it's great that they have taken the time to engage with the early Middle Ages. And I'm so glad they didn't skip them, because so often in popular history, either they skip straight from the Romans to the modern period, or they skip straight from the Romans to, knights in shining armor. But I quite like the early Middle Ages. I think it's a really fascinating period where you have a lot of transformation, a lot of social upheaval. Two of the biggest religions in the world today, Islam and Christianity, emerge in the late antique and early modern period and spread. It's this really, really exciting time. And of course, what to me makes it even more exciting is we have to do detective work with the sources.
Yes.
Which to me is actually quite fun. And I'm really glad that that was included as an element in this game, that you have to sort of figure out, and I like the way they showed photogrammetry and how you have to sort of make inferences. I think that's quite fun too. And I'm so glad that they're taking the players on this journey with them and not just sort of presenting them with this nice sort of smooth narrative and saying, well, that's how it was.
I'm afraid I'm about to get the mixture of this poultice wrong, so apologies. I have not been paying attention. I did play through this when it first came out. Ubisoft was nice enough to send me a review copy of Discovery Tour, in which I did exceptionally well in saving my fellow monk, but here I think we might be in a little bit of trouble.
Oh, but that's actually great, because I know that the developers, actually the wrong answers, they have funny responses and they work really hard with them. And in fact, the wrong answers are often supposed to be educational as well. So there you saw it. They mentioned, you should go get a kiss from the abbot. But of course, this monastery doesn't have an abbot, it has an abbess. And so if you choose the wrong answer, it's about to remind you about the monastery and so on. So actually getting the wrong answers is really helpful, because it sort of means that the people who put all the work into those, get their work gets used.
Yeah, it sees the light of day.
Yeah.
Well, I am a first-rate scholar, and so I would be embarrassed to not get the right answers. So,
No. But you got the right answer with feverfew, and that's quite important, because feverfew, this plant, is sometimes called medieval aspirin, and it appears in this remedy. And it's been attested by sort of modern examination to really be effective in relieving some kinds of pain. And it appears in lots of remedies, sort of ancient remedies throughout the world. And Bald's Leech Book is a particularly exciting book because Christina Lee and others at the University of Nottingham actually tested one of the remedies, not this one. It's an eye salve. And the remedy ended up being, in modern laboratory conditions, as reproduced but with modern ingredients, ended up being effective against MRSA, the antibiotic-resistant superbug.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah, so it's really exciting sort of collaborations that are going on between science and the humanities at this stage, thinking about some of these older remedies. Because Bald's Leech Book, it's easy to dismiss. It talks about elves, as I think you see in the game, that there's some answers involving elves. Apparently, the way you get elves to go away is you sing hymns at them, if you have that kind of problem. And it talks about goblins and things, so it's easy to sort of dismiss this as this is all magical, this is all pre-modern, pre-modern medicine isn't important. But there are some really interesting interactions between humanities and science that are taking place around this particular manuscript.
That's fantastic. That's so exciting. So it looks like the monastery is about to be attacked. So we'll skip ahead here to the last question, which is, do you think this type of work is something that you would want to pursue again? And furthermore, do you think this type of project is something that you would share with your students?
Absolutely. I think, as we mentioned, this is really important work, particularly for the early medieval period, to increase understanding of this period. And it's also, even for scholars, a really rich opportunity to think through how this world might have worked and how it might have looked. It's very easy to get caught up in just what the sources tell us and forget to ask those important questions about how life really worked. I had a former colleague who actually used to do little cartoons of everything she was studying, because she said that made you ask questions about, okay, how many people exactly are at this monastery? Who are in the surrounding area? Who else is here? What does it look like? How are people moving? But this game sort of means that you don't have to be an artist yourself. You can sort of interact with this game and start to get those questions going in your mind. And in fact, I've already shared it with some students. I showed them sort of an early version of the game and we discussed it. And I'm really looking forward to integrating it into my teaching. The designers of the game have very cleverly set it up so it can work for a variety of different levels.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be used to introduce younger students to the idea of the Middle Ages in general. For older students and for research students, it can be a springing off point for questions. Maybe did the monastery really look like that? What sort of choices were being made in the presentation here? When we're reconstructing medieval remedies? Even thinking about, do we have the same kinds of same kinds of ingredients? I know there was a big debate internally about the color of the carrots that are presented in the game.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And should you present the carrots as orange as we expect them today, or should we present them with sort of their original multicolored way? So this is really credit to the designers. They are thinking about this in such detail, but this makes it a really useful jumping off point for all kinds of debates for higher level scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just history that can use it. I think people teaching animation or teaching video games, because they've done this really great series of commentaries and sort of peeling back the behind the scenes and some of the decisions and how the photogrammetry works, that this could be a really great way for thinking through art and history, or for teaching animation and thinking through all the decisions that go into creating this kind of really top-notch, high-quality game.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I think that does it for my questions. Alison, thank you so much for your insight here and for your work on Discovery Tour. I think it was a great success.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being a forum for discussing history and games.
No problem. Okay. Dear listener, thank you also for joining us. If you are interested in keeping up with History Respawn, please visit our website at historyrespawn.com. And if you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/historyrespawn. And until next time, goodbye.